Buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Breyer Center for Overseas Studies in Florence. I'm Linda Campani, I'm the director of the program, and I have the distinct honor and the pleasure of introducing Professor Jane Tylus, who is our fourth speaker in this series, the spring quarter series of the Incontri a Palazzo. Jane Tylus is Professor of Italian Studies and Comparative Literature and the Director of the Humanities Initiative at New York University. This spring, she's the Robert Lehman Visiting Professor at Villa Tatti, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies here in Florence. Jane received her PhD in Comparative Literatures from Johns Hopkins University and her BA in English from the College of William and Mary. And the bio was about to fly away, but it's here. Jane has taught at NYU since 2003, where she was Vice Provost for Academic Affairs from 2005 to 2011. Prior to her appointment at NYU, she taught in the departments of Comparative Literature and French at the University of Wisconsin, where she also served as Associate Dean of Humanities. In spring 2012, she taught at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. She has held fellowships at the Newberry Library in Chicago and the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. She also spent a semester as a fellow at the University of Wisconsin's Institute for the Humanities. Jane's research interests include late medieval and early modern European literature, particularly Italian, of course, issues related to gender and religion, history of theater, literature of the 19th century Sicily, and the history and culture of Siena, of course. Jane is the author of several books, the titles of which I will not go through because there's way too many, but she's also the general editor of the journal Itati Studies in the Italian Renaissance. Again, as our fourth speaker of the spring 2015 Incontri a Palazzo lecture series, Jane is here to talk about the greatest enemy of Florence, Siena, which is the subject matter of this wonderful book that just came out. We would say in Italian, fresco di stampa. In English, you say it's hot, from the University of Chicago Press. So thank you so much, Jane, for having accepted our invitation to come speak at Stanford University in Florence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Linda, I want to thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I want to thank your staff, especially Beatrice and Alessio, and the Capone family for giving Stanford this beautiful palazzo. It's really quite extraordinary. It's my first time here, and I plan to come back. I also want to thank Dermot O'Connell, who has come up from Rome from the Almost Corner Bookshop in Trastevere, very kindly offering to come and sell copies of the book. So if you are at all interested, I've promised to give away no secrets about Siena, City of Secrets. So if you really want to find them out, you're just going to have to read. And Dermot, thank you for coming from Rome today to be with us. Because I've written a book, I decided not to write a talk. Instead, what I thought I would do, given that there are many images in Siena, City of Secrets, my editor was very encouraging about making sure this was as much of a visual experience as a verbal experience. Should I be close here? Okay, yeah, that's good. Sorry about that. I won't start from scratch, but I'll start from the beginning of that last sentence. Given that there are many images, and most of them are in color, in this in Siena, City of Secrets, which just came out with Chicago Fresco, as Linda just said, I thought I would show you some of those images and try to create a bit of a narrative around them to talk a little bit about what makes Siena special. Why isn't it Florence? Why are Siena and Florence such long-standing enemies? So these are some of the themes that I will try to approach a little bit tonight in my remarks over the next half hour or so. But I thought I would start by asking you for a vote. This is not my idea of a cover. It is the cover. This is the cover of the book. It's a cover chosen by the marketing department of the University of Chicago Press. that's their job, right, to figure out covers that attract the eye. It's also not my title. So I'm going to ask you for a vote about which cover do you like better. Do you like their choice? Or do you like my choice? Same with the title. Do you like their choice, Siena, City of Secrets? Or do you like my choice, Siena, Center of the World? So, think I'll go back and forth a few times. You can really, make sure that your vote counts. Cover of Chicago, cover of Jane. Title of Chicago, title of Jane. Who likes this cover better? Sorry, but I actually kind of like it better now too. Who likes this suggestive, moody color of the campo in the rain on a beautiful November morning? Thank you. You make me feel good about my photography. And now let's vote for the title. Siena, City of Secrets, Chicago's title. Yeah, go ahead and vote. You like it? Nobody likes this one. Well, I was outvoted in the press. All right, well, thank you. We'll have a little more audience interaction as this goes on. Like I said, thank you for appreciating my photo of the campo in the morning rain and fog in November. I think I've decided in the last about 72 hours that maybe this cover was the way to go, and here's why. Last week, I just got copies of the book in the mail, so I'm doing my job, doing my pitch for Chicago, and I suppose for myself, selfishly, and was peddling my book in Siena last week, running around to the 5 or 6 librerie to see if anyone could be interested enough to get some copies from the distributor in Germany. One, I think it was at Feltrinelli, they said, we have our own distributor, thank you very much. And I said, well, if you're interested in my book, here's a distributor, here he is, he's Uwe, I forget his last name, in Germany. And she said, oh, is the book coming out in German? In that case, we'll buy it. Siena does have a lot of German tourists. But at another libreria, this was at Mondadori in Via Cavolia, there was actually a book presentation going on. Someone else's book was being inaugurated by Lucio Balestacci, a wonderful Sienese historian. And at the end of his presentation, I went to the owner of Mondadori and asked if they would be interested in selling the book. And he got completely excited. He said, I don't know if we're going to sell the book or not, but this cover is amazing. And he went and got his father, who was also in the audience. And it turns out his father, who's an art historian, and was the former preside of the Scuola delle Belle Arti in Siena, a wonderful man named Fabio Mazzieri. Fabio was the man who, in 2009, dug this painting out of an attic in Venice. This is a painting. Does anyone know who painted this rather extraordinary painting? Does anyone know what it is a painting of? Palio, right. It's by the futurist artist Corrado Forlì, who painted this in 1937. He had spent, the August Palio in Siena. He did this painting, and then he wrote a rather nasty poem about the Sienese. And I'm not going to repeat for you these lines because it really is, in many ways offensive. Ask me later, it's a good secret to share, maybe over a glass of wine. But in any case, he was banned from coming back to Siena, having written this poem. And his painting was banished from being, he couldn't show his painting. He was in the army. He was killed in Moscow in 1943. His painting, his art, some of it was just lost. Other of it apparently was left in his house. And apparently the portiere of his apartment building ended up having a lot of his works. So when in 2009, Fabio Mazzieri, this gentleman who I met at Mondadori Friday night, decided he wanted to celebrate 100 years of Futurismo at the Pinacoteca in Siena. I don't know if any of you saw this exhibit. He brought in motorcycles, which were just being then built, put them next to Duccio and put them next to Vecchietta in the Sienese Pinacoteca. And then he tracked down where this painting was in the attic of the old Palazzo where Forlì lived in the 1930s. So and it was a major part of this exhibit, the first time exhibited in Siena. And you can't tell from the cover, but it's a very large painting. And so when Fabio's son saw my cover, his dad was there, we had this wonderful reunion, although we'd never met before. And it did convince me that this was the right cover. There's another reason, too, that I'll get to at the very end of my remarks tonight, but I think that as much as I love the mood here, and I certainly love the campo, maybe at the end of the day, the red snazzy Corrado Forlì painting is perhaps a little bit, not only more eye-catching for sure, but maybe ultimately more about my book. Perhaps the marketing people were right. As for the title, there are secrets in the book, so they figured out, for sure that there was something going on along that. But I do want to explain why originally I wanted it to be Siena, center of the world. If you've been to the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, you'll know there's a very old painting, only recently rediscovered. Some people think this is Balduccio. It's one man handing over his castle to the Sienese Republic from the 14th century, from the Trecento. But on top of this painting, as you can see, there are these skid marks. And the skid marks are caused, and we know this for a fact, by a gigantic wheel. It was a circular map, a disc, that rotated. That was by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, so painting about 30 years after Duccio would have painted this painting. And it was a big circular map of something. We don't know what that something actually is. The room is actually called, in the Palazzo Pubblico, the Sala del Mappamondo, right? The room of the map of the world. By the 1700s, this was such a tattered disc, you could actually pull it yourself. If you wanted to see something closely, you could have a good look, and you could kind of make the disc whirl around. By the 1700s, it was so tattered, it was so beat up, that they just tore it down. And unfortunately, we really have no description, and certainly no visual copy of what this map would have looked like when Lorenzetti painted it in the 1330s. One can imagine that it might have looked something like this wonderful mosaic from the pavimento of the Duomo. If you've been to Siena, I'm sure you've been in the Duomo, and for several weeks a year they let you see the entire pavimento. This particular bit of the pavement, of the floor, you can see all the time. And this is basically Siena positioning itself in relationship to other major Italian cities like Rome, like Florence, like Pisa. We have the rabbit of Pisa right here. Like Lucca, Florence, we could go around. But of course, who's at the center of this little map of Italian cities? Siena. And I wonder, was Lorenzetti's map just about Siena and other cities? Was it about Siena's provincia, which was enormous? Siena at one point had over 800 small towns coming to the Processione of the Madonna on August 15th with candles and other tributes to Siena. So was it a map of the province? Or like that old front cover of the New Yorker magazine maybe 10 or 15 years ago, was it a map of the world with Siena at the center and the rest of the world just kind of being rather peripheral around it? So that's the question I actually asked at the beginning of the book. Which world is or was Siena at the center of? Which world did Lorenzetti portray? Was it just the provincia? Was it the world of Italian cities? Was it the known world as it would have been in 1338 itself? So that's the little question about the title and the cover. If you want to know something about Siena, I'm not going to be pedantic and be a professor and go through like dates and give you a quiz at the end of this, so don't worry. I wanted to suggest perhaps a little bit about what it is to tell the history of Siena. So if you are just a non-Sienese like myself, and if you're a historian or an art historian, you're going to look at some dates like, okay, they had this government of the Nine between 1285 and 1355, this very stable period when Lorenzetti, in fact, was painting that map. You think about the horrible Black Death, which killed over half of the Sienese population in 1348. You would think very sadly, but very realistically, about the fact that in 1555, the Florentines laid siege to Siena for 15 months and finally either starved everyone in the city or made sure they left, and then took them over in July of 1555. This was one of Cosimo Primo de' Medici's great acts that ultimately got him the title of a Grand Duke. When you go into the Palazzo Vecchio right here in Florence and you look up in the very middle in the Salone del Cinquecento, one of the great things that you see if you're a Florentine is Cosimo planning the siege of Siena. And there he is in his study, planning the siege, which is then carried out and which then, wins. So if you're, again, a non-Sienese, here's your version of Sienese history. If you're Sienese, here's your version of Sienese history. 1260, don't forget, we beat them at Monteverdi. 1479, don't forget, we beat them at Poggibonsi. 1551, don't forget, we tore out the Fortezza, which the Spanish had put in with the help of the Florentines. And thank God, 1860, the Risorgimento, the creation of this new nation of Italy, we got the Florentines off our backs, right? That's the Sienese version of history. Now, I could go back to show the cover, but I won't. Who runs in the Palio? Here's a little exam part of the lecture. Who takes part in the Palio? The Contrade. 10 of the 17 neighborhoods into which Siena has been divided since the year 1730 take part in the Palio twice a year, and sometimes 3 times a year, because sometimes there are special Palios in September. So, if you are a member of a contrada, let's just, for example, say the contrada of the Selva, where I and my family had the wonderful good fortune to live for several summers and a January while I was writing this book. This is your version of Siena's history. The Selva, which was our contrada, this is the contrada that includes the Battistero, it includes a little piece of the hospital, it includes a great wine store, it includes the best pasticceria in Siena, called the Magnifico. I could go on, but the Selva's version of Siena's history is this. They've won the Palio all of these times, 6 times since 1980, plus 35. So again, different versions of Siena's history one might be able to think about. Now, okay, if you think about this, and in fact, there was a little article in the paper when Selva won in 2010 saying, wow, Selva's won 4 times in the new millennium. This is really something, given that in 4 centuries before this, they only won 35 times. So if you break that down, they've lost a lot. And I suppose that one could ask, and I'll just show you a Selva picture or two here. These are the Contrade. Here's the Selva flag. Here's a picture of the Selva winning, actually in 2010. And it's great to have family with you because family members really take good photos. I can't claim that a family member took this one, but a family member took this pretty remarkable photo of the packed contrada. A family member took this really great photo of the Palio itself. Palio, is a name for the race, but that's a kind of shortcut. The real Palion, or the real Palio, is the prize, and that prize is a banner which has some version of some representation of the Madonna on that banner. Once a year for the July Palio, the painter or the creator of that banner is a straniero. It's someone who is not from Siena. The August Palio is always created by Sienese. So, again, a wonderful tall family member got this picture of the Palio. And again, thank God for them because this was my contribution to pictures from the Palio of the year that the Selva won. Now, to go back to my question, the Selva only won 35 times over 4 centuries. That's to say they lost a lot. Why put yourself through this, right? Why do the Sienese subject themselves to losing again and again and again and again, and only every now and then winning? Really rarely. It's pretty amazing the Selva has won 4 times, in a 10-year period. One of my favorite scholars of Siena, someone who I quote quite a lot in my book, Gabriele Piccini, who recently wrote a wonderful little pamphlet. I really recommend it for those of you who want a quick fix on Siena, Città Morata, Città Globale. Talks about one of the main traits of Siena being its capacity, even its desire, as she puts it, to monumentalize and learn from its failures, monumentalize and learn from its losses. These are painful losses, right? Every Palio for these poor Selva people, year after year, losing the Palio, along, of course, with 8 other contrade, but even so, it's humiliating after a while. What I have here before you, and I'm sure many of you recognize this, is perhaps the greatest monument of failure in Siena. It's not a horse race. It's a building. It's a failed building. It's the facciatone, as it's called, or the incomplete facade to the incomplete Duomo Nuovo, the new cathedral, the new dome. You see it everywhere, not just when you're standing right in front of it. If you're standing, as I'd like to do, one of my favorite views of Siena is this one. This is from the southernmost church in Siena, Santa Maria dei Servi, from which steps you have this beautiful view of the city. But what is one of the most prominent things you see? The facciatone. The Duomo itself, the cupola, is beyond it. You have the campanile. And we have to imagine that were the Duomo Nuovo finished, it would have been the largest church in the history of in Christendom when it was begun to be built in the 14th century. That's what the Sienese wanted. Bigger than that Duomo in Florence, which, didn't even yet have a dome at that point in the 1300s. And B, it would have completely dominated the skyscape. It would have completely dominated this landscape that we look at from a place like Santa Maria dei Servi. What happened? They picked a bad moment to start it. They picked the 1330s. 10 years later, what happens? I could go back to that little list of dates, but I won't. The Black Death. They lose the operai, right? They lose the engineers. They lose the money. So not only do they lose their workforce to complete the Duomo Nuovo, but you also have an engineer. He turns out to have been Florentine, so I suppose he shouldn't have been trusted. But an engineer shows up and says, in 1353, so the Black Death is over, and they're thinking, gee, maybe we can make this work out. Maybe we can go back and create the Duomo Nuovo. He says, this is on one of Siena's 3 weird hills. More about that in a second. It's just not going to sustain the weight. You guys better stop building this Duomo. And for whatever reason, the Sienese listened to the Florentine engineer, and the Duomo Nuovo was not completed. As Gabriele Piccini goes on to say, another city would just have torn down that facciatone and got on with it. But the Sienese, 600, almost 700 years later, still have the facciatone as a monument to failure, as a monument to loss. This may seem just an historical, tidbit, but in fact, as all of us know, probably, there have been other failures, much more recent ones. As I was writing this book, and in fact, at one point, one of the presses I went to see if they wanted to publish the book said, well, we don't really want a book called Siena Center of the World, but we'd love a book on the crisis of their bank. And I said, well, when I turn myself into an economic historian, I'll let you know. In the meantime, I'll find someone else to publish the book. But in these very months that I was living there and writing the book, the Monte dei Paschi, the oldest bank in Italy, in Europe, one of the third largest bank in Italy, went through a series of shocking realizations, or I should say, the rest of the world had some shocking realizations about information that some of the higher-ups in the bank already knew, and I'm not going to go through that, and since I'm not an economic historian, I don't really understand everything, but suffice it to say that there's been a tremendous shock to what has been a very prosperous city, thanks not only to the bank, the Monte dei Paschi, but also to the Fondazione, the foundation which the bank has overseen for over 2 centuries, and which has been the life's blood of the soccer team, the basketball team, the university, the museums, the Palio, and many other things. And one notes a difference now going to Siena and finding museums shut on certain days and finding many fewer books being published by the Monte dei Paschi. Perhaps there'll be less glamorous Palios in our future. But again, my point is a very simple one, and it's just that failure has been a part of Siena's life. And Gabriele Piccini's point, when Siena was angling to become the next cultural capital of Europe, it lost out to Matera, perhaps justly. This was something chosen just this past fall. And again, it was so typically Sienese. I went to Siena on the day of the announcement from Rome. They were reading, I think it was either late October, early November, they were reading in Rome, the members of the EU committee that were choosing the next Italian city to be the next cultural capital of Europe. And everybody was tense. There were about 400 of us gathered in the Mercato Vecchio in Siena, just below the Palazzo Pubblico. And they had this, live transmission from Rome. They had it all hooked up. We were all watching. It was going to happen at 5 o'clock. At 1:55, the transmission went out. so we found out that Matera won because one of the guys who was in charge of the transmission called his friend who was a journalist who was there in Rome. So again, it just kind of, it just wanted to show us, okay, there's something about failure going on here, and darn, they didn't even win the nomination of the European Union. But Gabriele Piccini's point is really this one. By monumentalizing our failures, we learn from them. And as she was writing a book pitched to winning the Cultural Capital of Europe distinction, she was also saying, you should choose Siena because we've weathered hardships and we've gotten through them. And the fact that the bank has failed us at this moment, shouldn't be indicative of why you shouldn't choose us. It's indicative of why you should. We'll get through this too, and we can be a model for other European cities that are also struggling with failures. So again, her book is a wonderful read. I think it makes some wonderfully salient points about Sienese history, but also Sienese contemporaneity. But I want to just move on a little more quickly now to some more historical arguments about why, at the end of the day, Siena really shouldn't exist at all. Not only has it had all these failures, but really, it shouldn't even be there. Look at this map. It's a weird map. It's a weird-looking map, but it's really hard to draw a map of Siena because there's no Roman castrum, as there is here in Florence. The Romans didn't want it because there's these 3 oddly shaped hills, or as Francesco Vanni, the first map maker of Siena in the late 16th century, said, tre colline stranissime. They're just really weird, uneven hills. So the Romans couldn't use this for a military camp. The Etruscans didn't want this because the hills weren't high enough to really create a good, defensible city. You can just roll right into the northern end on the Via Camelia of Siena. The rest of Siena is very mountainous, but that northern front, which unfortunately faces their great friend Florence, is very difficult to defend. So for that reason, the Etruscans said forget about it, the Romans really basically said forget about it. The real reason they said forget about it, in addition to the strange hills, either too low or too high, was there's no water in Siena. There's no river. Where do you go for water? So the ingenious Sienese, who would not take failure for an answer, and I'll say why all of a sudden there were a lot of Sienese in Siena in a second, but they bore deep into the ground to create the so-called buttini, the tunnels that go as far as 24 kilometers out of the city. They don't go to sources, they don't go to fountains. It's not that simple. They just collect the water that drips into the tunnels, and they all come out into wonderful places like the Fonte Gaia in the middle of the Campo. This was the first fountain in the center of Siena ever created in the 15th century, and then Jacopo della Quercia, the wonderful sculptor, put up his sculptures around the Fonte Gaia. Before that, you had to go outside the city to get your water. So again, life in Siena is tough. You have weird hills, you have no water. Why ever would you want to build a city there? Well, in fact, there really wasn't a city there until people started moving through this area on the so-called Via Francigena, the Pilgrims. Siena is ultimately a city of pilgrims. This is why we have a place on three strange hills with no water. Because between around 900 and 1,000, 1100, you begin to have massive numbers of people moving from one holy site in Italy, namely Lucca, with its Volto Santo, to Rome, with, of course, its seven wonders and all the other things that you had to see in Rome. And Siena, unlike Florence, was, kind of on this route, the shortcut route from Lucca to Rome. It was not in the Maremma, that is to say, its hills were high enough to, allow you not to get malaria. And in fact, even today, you Florentines, you don't want mosquitoes, go to Siena. There are no mosquitoes in Siena that I've ever experienced. It's just high enough on these three strange hills to avoid the Florentine summer plague of the zanzare. So try it. And the pilgrims knew this, and the pilgrims wanted to avoid the Maremma, and they wanted to avoid Florence. So, this place, looks like it's hilly enough to avoid the zanzare. And in fact, they did. So around the massive numbers of pilgrims flooding from Lucca to Rome, and then some would go beyond, onto the Terra Santa, others would go the other way to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. They'd stop at many other places in between. Little by little, Siena becomes a point of access for Pellegrini. And in fact, in this little street, which is now a dead end, but was not always, you can still see some of what is called the original terrain of the Via Francigena, some of the original cobblestones that were put down for pilgrims passing through around the year 1100. And one of my favorite panels from Duccio's great Maestà, this is a work that you see almost as though it were in a shrine, and it did indeed used to be in the Duomo, it's now in the Pinacoteca. We have Jesus approaching two disciples after the resurrection, the so-called road to Emmaus. And if you look closely at Jesus, I'll go back to the other slide in a second, but if you look closely at Jesus, in all the other panels of Jesus in Duccio's Maestà that represent his life after the resurrection, he's wearing this beautiful blue coat lined with gold. Here he's wearing a garment that anyone would distinguish from the 14th century as a pilgrim's garment. A rough, almost hareskin type, overcoat. He's got his hat on his back, and he's got his bisaccio or his little pouch on his side. And I'm sorry I couldn't blow this up even bigger, but if you look at the hat, you might make out, some little things on it. It's got a shell on it. And if you look at the bisaccio, you'll notice a little, almost like a souvenir, which happens to be an imitation of the Volto Santo in Lucca. Jesus is showing up here as a pilgrim. And in fact, when he shows up after his resurrection, the disciples don't recognize him. They say, "Tu peregrinus." Where are you going? Where are you from? And the word when Jerome translated the Bible into Latin just means, a stranger. But over the centuries, peregrinus or pilgrim takes on as well the intimations of someone traveling for a religious voyage. So in fact, here we have in Duccio's wonderful Maestà, painted around 1305, we have Jesus as a real pilgrim, someone who would have been coming through Siena. And speaking of Siena, if you look at the road, you've got stones on the outside, and then once you get into the gateway, you've actually got brick. And Duccio, who was on the building commission of Siena for many years, was actually in charge of passing some of the laws after 1298 that bricked in the Campo, and then bricked in the city streets that came in from the gates. So this is actually Siena, into which Jesus at the Pellegrino is being invited, as the disciples say, "We don't know you, Peregrinos, but come in and eat with us." And I just want to suggest to you that if I've talked about Siena as a place of failures, and indeed we can continue to talk about those, it's also the place of at least one fabulous success. And that success is its Spedale di Santa Maria della Scala, the hospital of literally St. Mary of the Stairs. The stairs here being the few stairs that lead you down from the Duomo, across the very skinny piazza to this amazing structure that is called the Ospedale della Scala. When you look at it from the front, all you see is this very drab brick building. It used to be much more colorful because the same Lorenzetti who painted that map that's now gone also painted the whole life of Mary, now gone, in beautiful colors. You've got to go to the back, and this is the back of the Ospedale, to realize its immensity, to realize that it's a city in a city. One of my favorite words that you hear in Siena all the time is inglobare. It was englobing constantly streets, properties, farmland, to create a bigger and better Ospedale. In fact, until 1925, it was the largest hospital in Europe, which is really quite something to think about. And yet, it wasn't a hospital in the sense of the modern word hospital that we're thinking about here. A hospital in which St. Catherine worked with lepers, as well as pilgrims, as well as orphans. And right before it closed, a hospital where Italo Calvino, the great writer, died in 1985, 10 years before the Ospedale closed, after he had a stroke in Siena, shortly before he was to come to Harvard and give his lectures. There's a room in the Ospedale called the Pellegrinaio. I was looking up a little bit earlier today on Wikipedia because I wanted a couple of images of the Pellegrinaio that I didn't have. It's translated in English on Wikipedia as the Pilgrims' Lane, which is not what I would have thought of. I would say the Pilgrims Hall. This was a big room where male pilgrims could spend up to 3 nights when they came in from their travels from Lucca or from Rome or Santiago de Compostela. And in the 1440s, this vast hall, or lane, was covered with frescoes talking about what the hospital did. So in this instance, where our pilgrim is from, I just had a clip a second ago of 2 pilgrims standing in a bread line. You can see on their hats they have the shell of Santiago de Compostela and the Volto Santo. Here they are in the larger fresco in which you see members of the hospital giving bread. On Wednesdays, they always gave bread. Here we see another wonderful image from this hallway in which we have orphans being taken care of. The orphans would be brought to the Ospedale in the middle of the night. The nurses that would come running in, they had their little house around the corner to nurse. These children would learn how to write. Here we see a little writing and reading lesson in the front for this one young lad. And then eventually, this is the entire fresco, on the right-hand side, you see the marriage of a young girl who would spend her whole life in the orphanage. The hospital would pay for her dowry. If it was a young boy, when he became 16 or 18, they would find him a job and make sure that they would subsidize whatever stipend he received as an apprentice. So it's a hospital that takes care of those who have been otherwise abandoned in life, as well as those who take care of pilgrims. It also, of course, was a hospital in the classic sense. Here we have physicians tending to a man with some rather ugly-looking wounds. And on the left-hand side, you can't really see it, we have someone being carried in on a stretcher. So it's a hospital in the classic sense of the word, but also a hospital in non-classic senses. It's an orphanage. It provides incredible social services to the poor. It gives out clothes. And it all comes from, according to the Sienese, the dream of a cobbler. And it's interesting that he's a cobbler. Cobblers make shoes. Pilgrims need shoes. So we have a sense of someone who, mythological figure in the year 800 or 900, had a dream about these little children. They're going up to Mary. The real Scala of Santa Maria della Scala is the ladder by which orphans go to Mary. He wanted to found a place that would take care of the poor, the needy, the abandoned, including pilgrims and the sick. And so the Ospedale della Scala, this great institution in Siena's life, is what transpires, again, eventually becoming the largest hospital in Europe. Now, you say, okay, they were giving all this money to the orphans, they had all these huge rooms, they could buy property. How did it function? How did it support itself? I'm just going to very briefly suggest that one place in the city you should all see beside the Ospedale. You can't really go in, but you can look at it. This is the exact center of Siena. This is where the 3 main roads of Siena converge. The road that goes to Rome, the road that goes to Florence, and the road that goes to the Duomo, and ultimately the sea. This is called the Loggia della Mercanzia, and in this loggia we had, as of the 1400s, 1500s, the moneyed people of Siena, its merchants and its bankers gathering. Why merchants and bankers? Why were these the ones who made Siena their home, or I should say, who made Siena rich? There's a wonderful quote by the Czech scholar who eventually came to live in Siena and make it his home, Ludovico Zetkauer, who says, the quintessential Sienese banker can be seen as a secular pilgrim and lower-class knight, often a young man willing to take risks that his elders would not, and always ready to come back to Siena to invest his fortunes in making the city more prosperous and beautiful. I want to think about that word beauty for a second. But I also want to just say that bankers and merchants started out They had to leave the city because there was nothing there, right? You know, you couldn't make textiles because there was no water. You couldn't have industry because, you know, these three strange hills. You had to go places, but then you were committed to bringing things back. They did make money in the city for one huge reason. Pilgrims needed to change their money. And so the original bankers of Siena, the guys who brought you ultimately the failed Monte dei Paschi di Siena, were people who were money changers. Their money-changing skills went from the pilgrims who came through Siena to ultimately enter England, many popes, many other members of the nobility throughout Italy and throughout Europe, and these were the guys who really made Siena what it became and poured money into institutions like the hospital. This idea about making the city beautiful, you know, in a phrase you could say, you know, making sure that money is transformed into beauty, we see in as basic an object as the so-called bicerne, the account books or the ledger books. These are books about Siena's, you know, what comes in and what goes out of the city. How do we keep track of it? These are ledger books which accountants would keep, but they all wanted to have nice covers. And the covers initially, as we see here from these two covers of the 1250s, are of the actual job of counting money and writing down in the ledgers. Little by little, there's a transformation of these bicerne into bona fide works of art on their own. And the Archivio di Stato of Siena, 9:30, 10:30, and 11:30 every morning but Sunday. You can go into the Archivio and have a tour, but also see on your own because they're very unobtrusive, about 80 or so of these bicerne covers, which go from the 1250s all the way into the 17th century. They are both, again, monuments to beauty, not of failure here, but of success. But they also become almost like newspaper items. You know, for example, when the Sienese took down that Spanish fort in 1551, the cover of the bicerne that year is the fort being torn down. So again, money or transactions with money turned into something that's beautiful. That's exactly what these covers produce for us. If the merchants and bankers were going in and out, it meant they were leaving the city to go into the countryside. And I'm sure for many of you, if you've seen one artwork or are familiar with one artwork of Siena, it's this one. In the Palazzo Pubblico, another Ambrogio Lorenzetti works, the effects of good government, of buon governo. And here we have on the left the city and on the right the country. What's fascinating is that Lorenzetti gives us both. And this is really, I guess, one of the last points that I want to be making, is that the merchants are going in and out, the bankers are taking advantage of other people going in and out like the pilgrims. But at the end of the day, what feeds the orphans? What feeds the poor who come into the bread line on Wednesday? What feeds the Sienese citizens? It's that countryside. And with the Spedale, here's a better shot of some of these nobles leaving Siena to go into that countryside. If one of the things that enables the Spedale to function are the bankers, the other huge thing that enables it to function, and Siena to function as well, is the countryside. And over the centuries, the Spedale created 17 so-called grance, or basically huge farm networks in the Campagna, south of Siena, where they would just organize thousands of contadini, many priests, many bureaucrats, many accountants, to bring in, to organize the productivity of the countryside and to bring it into Siena to feed the orphans, to feed the pilgrims, to feed the poor, but also to feed Siena itself. You can go to Cunha. This is the closest Grancia to Siena. It's about 8 kilometers south of Siena. You can see Siena from standing in the Grancia. You stand in this now very abandoned fort, because it was a fort. They had to protect the farm from, invasion and other people coming in. You stand in this now abandoned fort. There's the entrance to the fort, and there's some of the countryside around it. And you just get a sense, you try hard to get a sense of all the furious activity that was going on in this countryside to allow for a prosperous Siena in the Middle Ages. When we went a couple of years ago, there's no one there but a couple of stray cats. There was an old farmer driving around, and on his tractor, he wasn't so sure who these, Americans were walking around in his Grancia of Cunha. So at this point, it's been utterly abandoned. They were even holding outdoor cinema there until about 2010, but they were worried the roof would collapse during a movie, and have now abandoned the cinema there as well. So I think that just to kind of wrap up on my point about Siena's huge success, the Spedale is in many ways, I think, a metaphor, more than a metaphor. It's a very substantial metaphor until 1995, a 1,000-year metaphor as to what was special about Siena, a place where people came who needed homes, who needed sustenance, who needed clothing, in the case of orphans, who needed a family, and Siena took them in. Siena, that is to say, has been an extraordinarily hospitable city, despite what I think many of us perceive as the closedness of the contrade, the closedness of Siene's life. That is to say, I think that there's a paradox at the heart of Siene's life that I try in my book to understand. Now, I want to go back in closing to the cover and to what I suggested earlier was maybe the secret I discovered in working on this book. Roberto Barzanti, who is I'm proud to claim as a friend, who also was the youngest mayor ever of Siena. He was mayor of Siena in the late 60s, 70s. Did a lot of necessary transformations in the city's politics and its cultural and social structure when he was mayor. Has written many things, and you can often find his rubrica on Siena in the Corriere Fiorentino and La Nazione, that comes out in Siena as well. He had this to say about the Palio, so this takes me back to the cover. And to Corrado Forlini. When Siena lost to Florence, we have to acknowledge this fact, in 1555, when Siena lost to Florence, the Contrada took up the mission of remembering the history of a great city and the job of organizing the Palio, which began in the mid-16th century to be what it is today, a celebration about survival, the celebration of an illusion. I'm not sure what that illusion is, and I think I'd have to be Sienese to really get at that, and I'm not going to try. But I do think that in many ways it's the celebration about survival. Since the Selva has become, kind of our little contrada, although I'm still waiting to be baptized into the Selva. So if there are any Selvaiola here, let me know, and maybe we can work that out. But we've been asked to go, and we have gone to the Cinetta. This is the dinner before the Palio, the night before the Palio. They sing their song about the Selva. Oh, Selva, little Selva, go, you'll win the Palio. And when the flags sail up to the sky, the Selva will come in first, at full cry. Oh, Selva, little Selva, go. Today you'll win the Palio. Now, Selva is the smallest contrada in terms of numbers, in terms of population. So Selvina, right, Selvina, Val, little Selva, it's not just an endearing term, it's actually true. They are little. They're the smallest contrada by terms of population. There's a lot of hope in this song, Song of the Cinetta. You're going to win. And again, they've only won, 400-something years, they've only won 41 times. So the odds are not good that they're going to win, any Palio as it's going on, in fact. But I think that this idea of speranza, this idea of hope, every year they're singing about the Selvina, this nice little Palio, this nice little contrada winning. I think there's a lot to this in terms of something that you don't see when you stand right below Palazzo Pubblico and see this very static tower. This is, of course, the tower, Mangia, as it's called, of the Palazzo Pubblico that juts into the sky, that is exactly the same height as the campanile of the Duomo, making secular and sacred exactly equal in the city. In a way, it's good the Facciatone is all that we have left, because it means the Duomo can't ever really dominate that landscape. There's always going to be an equality between the secular and the sacred. But this tower is a static thing. And the fact that on the clock of this tower, there's only one hand of a clock instead of two, makes it seem even more static. That little hand, it's just one hand, just goes around so slowly you barely notice it. And this, I find, is something that is ultimately an antithesis to what is the true secret of Siena. And that is the fact that it is constantly a city in movement. In fact, much of what I hope I've shared with you in the last half hour, 35 minutes, has been about Siena as a city of movement. And if you don't mind, I thought I would just indulge myself, if not you, by reading, in closing, a paragraph and a half from the introduction, in which I try to capture for myself what I think Siena is about. And I'd like to think that these fabulous marketing people at the University of Chicago Press also read the introduction, and perhaps from that decided that this cover, rather than that moody, nebulous shot of a static campo, was the way to go. So I'll close just reading a page. And I start in the middle, obviously, of an introduction here, but I'm noting that there's a new political party in Siena, as all these failures of the bank and other things are going on, that has for its slogan, Siena cambia. Siena is changing, or Siena change, right? The sense of, okay, we've been stuck in a rut, right? Let's move on. So I take that as my little clue here, and here's what I say. The slogan is intended to counter not only the Sienese 500-year dependence on a bank that has now failed them, but the impression that for some time Siena has been a city remote from the rest of the world. When you see Siena from a distance, it can seem immobilized upon the hill, clay buildings baked into the land. This is what most guidebooks, in fact, tell you. It is unchanged since Lorenzetti painted his Mappamondo before the Black Death, before the decline of Siena's international influence, before the fall to Florence, before the dull centuries of Medici and then Habsburg oversight shut down its energy, before the railroad and the autostrada abandoned it to a proud isolation in the center of Tuscany. This is part of its charm, one is told. This is why we must contrast it with livelier cities like Florence or Rome, an inevitable comparison from which Siena inevitably suffers. It takes several days to see living cities, only half a day to see a dead one. Mummified like the animals in the Museum of the Fisiocritici, 18th century Sienese academics who prided themselves on capturing every species that flew or crawled in the Sienese countryside and embalmed them forever in their museum on the Via Tuffi. Thus you can prowl around on foot, fantasizing about the days of Duccio and St. Catherine, as you tour the 13th century Gothic cathedral or the 14th century Palazzo Pubblico, perhaps climbing its tower to stare down at the Campo, with its arc of buildings capped by homogeneous brown roofs and colored, inconsistent, dull earth tones. From there, you might notice the sweep of the Sienese horizon south to Mount Amiata, sitting like a luckless ship on the borders of what were once the Papal States. But this stasis appears only in the bird's eye view. Siena has long been on the cutting edge of innovation. The first city to pave its streets, we saw that Duccio Maestà, and its main piazza, saving residents and horses from continual onslaughts of mud and worse, 1298. The first city to write its constitution in the vernacular, 1309. The first city with a publicly funded university, 1321. The first to use the cambiale or the promissory note, 1720. The first to bar traffic from its center, 1965. Much to the surprise of cousins of ours, and their son is actually sitting in the back, Tom, it's great to see you, who on their honeymoon plowed into the Campo in their rental car and were escorted out by understanding Sienese cops. Siena is central now to discussions about urban environments, and architects are fond of seeing in the city's strong sense of place a model for new sustainable communities. These innovations are all based on what I consider Siena's secret: movement. The movement of people, of water, of animals, of things, of money, of sound, through Siena and around it and out beyond its enclaves, driving it to change in small ways and large, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes dramatically. The Palio, won one time by the Selva during our 3 summers there, is the most obvious example of this dance, as the 1930s painter and poet Corrado Furlin recognized in his explosive painting of the race, publicly exhibited for the first time in Siena only in 2009. For the Palio is not just about horses running around again and again in a circle. Furlin's image, with its dashing horses and its spiked towers, is a Palio on fire, and Furlin himself commented on the gasoline or the benzina of ritual, bringing with it energy and danger and life. I hope that you'll be interested in knowing other secrets of Siena. I'd be delighted to share some more with you during the question and answer period, but again, I want to thank Linda and her staff and you for your attention, and I really hope, I hope you'll read the book, but even better, I hope you'll go to Siena and enjoy its fabulous, fabulous people, culture, food, and city. Thank you so much.
For this wonderful talk, which makes one want to read the book, makes one want to go to Siena, and it really, the way in which you're looking at Siena really makes it come alive once again. As you pointed out, Siena has been going through some very difficult years, especially after the crisis of the Monte dei Paschi, and they're having lost the race or the competition to become La Città della Cultura. So this is, I think it's also an extraordinary gift that you're making to the city of Siena, which I think will be greatly, very greatly appreciated. And we would like to open it up for questions. You touched upon a number of very, very interesting things. So please share your thoughts and questions with Professor Tylus.
Yes, I'm curious why there are 2, and you said sometimes 3 palio each summer.
Good point. every now and then, Siena decides to have this palio straordinario. For example, the 2000 palio, which the Selva won, was a palio for the new millennium. So often, if there's a world event that's very interesting that they want to kind of tie a palio to, there were, I think, during the fascist era, they had all kinds of, extraordinary palios to celebrate various things that were going on in Italy in the 1930s. But again, when St. Catherine of Siena became the patron saint of Europe, they had an extraordinary Catherine palio. So, and I'm not sure the decision-making process for that, but typically, you're right, there's only 2 a year, July 2nd and August 16th. And in fact, I was just talking yesterday to Anna Benstead, who is the wife of the director of Itati, Lino Pertile, who said, yeah, the last time we were in Siena, it was about 5 years ago, and we just thought we would pop in for a nice summer day, and as we were driving there was more and more traffic. They hadn't realized it was July 2nd, and it was the palio. That said, it's a great place to go for the palio. In fact, I realize parking is probably tough if you're driving in for the day, but it's certainly worth experiencing once. But thank you, that's a great question, and I have to confess I don't know when the most recent extraordinary palio was, but there certainly was one in 2000 for the millennium. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm very curious about the marketing team
About?
discovered the copertina. So were they researchers that how did they discover the copertina?
Well, in fact, I already had the copertina in the book, in the illustrations.
Oh, really?
I did. So, in fact, the page I just read from, I used the illustration to talk about Corrado Forlin and this idea of benzina or gasoline. So, but then, it showed me that they really looked at the manuscript. They really, I don't know how much of the book they read, but they noticed this illustration. They thought this would be much better than that boring, photo of the campo. And so I've been very impressed with the work they've done. And I saw it at this exhibit in 2009 in the Pinacoteca when it was, this very, again, edgy, spiky painting, right, next to, I think it was the cabinet of Vecchietta in the Pinacoteca. So you have this kind of very sedate, somber colored tones of the Quattrocento painting, and then next to it you had Corrado Forlin. And it was that juxtaposition was quite impressive.
I think on the copertina issue, you're giving too much credit to the University of Chicago. Not only did you discover it, but I think the idea of using or going back to a futurist painting in relation to Siena is very, very new. Mm-hmm. Futurism, you've done everything of futurism in Siena. You might associate it with many other things, including Firenze, but certainly not Siena. But instead, the idea of movement, of speed, of velocity, of change, which is embedded in futurism, mm-hmm. and very much so in this painting, is so true. Or you make us think and see how it is true, in fact, of Siena as well. I don't think anybody had thought about this before. So, it's a very new way of looking at the city of Siena. And the palio itself is movement, is the epitome of movement in many respects, but there's much more movement starting with the Pilgrims. So I think it's truly a red thread. It's her credit, not me.
Thank you. And I should say that I divide the book into chapters, which are about what moves through Siena. So the 5 chapters are water, pilgrims, money, neighborhoods that sponsor movement, and saints. I didn't talk at all tonight about saints, and you're probably sick of hearing about Saint Catherine and other Sienese saints, but they move too, not always through, but sometimes out. So thank you. I appreciate that comment. Yes, Michael.
I was wondering if you could say something about an image in the book that, if you said something about it, I missed it. One of the things I love about the book is that while much of it is about the past, there are a few things like the Forlin painting that are very much about Siena's more recent history. And there's a painting early on in the book, I think it's image 4 or 5, entitled Maiale.
Oh, yeah. By Antonio Possenti.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a pig.
And I wonder if you could say something about it.
Yeah, wow, someone's already read the book.
I read
You're one of the reviewers. So, yes, as I mentioned earlier, there's 35 illustrations. I'm very happy that so many of them are in color. In fact, there's only 2 black and white, and those 2 black and white pictures were both taken by my son using black and white film. And I kind of like the contrast in a way. When you have all the color, it's like you can rest your eyes on a black and white. photo looking down from the Facciatone, because what I didn't say about that Facciatone and why it's not a total failure, so you've been to Siena, you know, you can climb up on that, you know, what should have been the new entrance into the new Duomo and have a spectacular view of the city. So I think when Piccini talks about monuments to failure, she's also saying, but yeah, the Sienese turned that Facciatone into a great tourist gig, right? You go up there and have a great view of the city. Anyway, to get back to Michael's point. Yes, it's figure 4 of the city, and I know nobody can see this, but Antonio Possenti is a contemporary artist, a very wonderful contemporary artist who has had several exhibits in Siena, one of which was focused on the beast fables, the bestie, of the great 20th century Sienese writer Federico Tozzi. Tozzi had a love-hate relationship with Siena. He was born just outside the gates in a farm. His father owned a tavern. It's still there, in fact, on the road that goes to San Francesco. He hated the life of the tavern. He hated the life of the farm. He couldn't wait to leave. He goes to Rome like St. Catherine and dies about 2 blocks from where St. Catherine died in Rome, in Santa Maria sopra Minerva. And he wrote these beast fables, which are about his childhood in Siena. And one is maiale, one is pig. And with maiale, he talks about the place in Siena called Fonte Branda, one of the great fountains, which was probably the center of Sienese life before the Fonte Gaia was put in. He writes about Fonte Branda as a place where the macellai, the butchers, were, and this is, of course, where the pigs were killed. So he talks about hearing the squealing of the maiale. It's a horrible image, right? In 1910, 1908, as a kid, as he was going up and down the suicidal streets of Fonte Branda. If you've been to Siena, you know, unlike Florence, unless you go to San Miniato, where I know Dermot went this afternoon when he came in from Rome, Florence is flat. You know, Siena is a place of hills, although there's always another way. And in fact, you know, one of my favorite little I love to eavesdrop in Siena. One of my favorite eavesdropping conversations was this Sienese woman who was talking to 2 rather elderly tourists. You know, they were obviously asking directions, and she said, "Se siete camminatori," you know, if you're hikers, you can take the suicidal road, but I don't think you are, so go this way. What Federico Tozzi is commenting on in Bestia is the combination of hearing the sounds coming up the suicidal road from Fonte Branda, of the poor maiali, you know, screaming as the macellai do their thing. And Antonio Possenti came out with these beautiful, beautiful images. And, you know, in this case, it's fun. It's almost a Chagall-like image of a guy on a pig's back. It's the macellai trying to stab him, but the hog is enormous, so he's not going to go down. And behind him is one of the hills of Siena with its suicidal streets. I love the Possenti images of the Tozzi. I love the Bestia. I think they're really fun reading. And in fact, if I ever have time, I mean, Tozzi's one of the guys I would love to translate, both for his novels, which, you know, have not come out in major editions, but the Bestia have never been translated. So his Beast Fables with Possenti's illustrations are a great read. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
One of the things that talking about Siena as a city that can look to the future is the way that they've rearranged the traffic in the past 2 decades. It's gone from a city like Florence, full of traffic and full of air pollution and dangerous streets to cross and everything else, to a city that's almost got no traffic going through because they've created all those underground garages that with entrances all around the city, so that it's a completely 21st century city in comparison to many of the other Italian cities.
No, thank you so much for pointing that out. There are 3 scale mobile, right? You can take them up from San Francesco, from Fonte Branda, and from the train station. There are plenty of parking lots exactly outside the city. And one of my favorite things about Siena, you know, here in Florence, you're trying to walk on a sidewalk about this big. Siena doesn't have sidewalks. There are no sidewalks. Why is this? Well, it's because it's a city for the pedestrian. And so you're absolutely right about, you know, the level of fog and pollution, which in any case they would never have like Florence because they are on 3 strange hills, they're not in a valley. But even so, this attentiveness to greening their city is I think really, really admirable. So no, absolutely. And you know, one of the secrets I will not give away is where we park when we come to Siena.
One final question.
How did they manage to get rid of the TV antennas? That's the thing one of the things I admire most about Siena, compared to other cities. there are almost no TV antennas.
Almost no TV antennas?
Yes, if you've ever noticed that. Compared to Florence, if you're up on a roof, you look around and we're invaded by TV antennas, but they're almost non-existent in Siena.
I didn't realize that. Does someone know the answer to that?
I know that they,
Yes.
I know that actually they made antennas and satellites underneath. They want to do that even in San Gimignano, but not yet.
Okay.
But, well, that's news that I got.
So it's all underground
Yes.
cables at this point. That's great. So, they're masters of the Bottini, right? They're masters of going underground. And they obviously went underground for telecommunications. That's great. I didn't realize that. I'll make sure that detail I'll credit you is in the second edition.
We're really tight